When Jim first asked me to speak this afternoon, I really wasn't sure how I was going to contribute meaningfully and in a positive way to the conversation. But having heard what's going on so far, and by the way, Sarah, are you still here? Excellent job. That was a very nice video, and see me before I leave. I think the thing that maybe I can bring most to this conversation is another perspective. Oops, we better get my PowerPoint up, hadn't we?
You got this one there.
Well, we'll just call that partially an introduction, and we'll get into the show. There we go. Well, one of the things that I think is very important to keep in mind as we discuss this whole issue of food, and as I go through these few slides, I thought we were going to have 15 minutes, but it's good. I think we'll have a little more time to discuss some of these things. What we talk about here in terms of food deserts and access to safe, healthy, adequate supplies of food aren't unique to Illinois, aren't unique to any single location in the United States. Last week I was in Brazil all week, and as you'll see here in a little bit, ADM is, and I'll tell you a little bit more about ADM, but we're a very large corporation. Our companies and our offices are literally all over the world. We see a lot. I spent 30 years as a policeman. My degree was in sociology, so I've had the benefit over these 60-some plus odd years. I get the senior citizen discount sometimes, of having seen a lot of the theories that you hear about in school play out, but not only in the United States in our urban environments, but also internationally. And I can tell you that everything that we talk about here in relation to food deserts, the worst that you've seen in that video is not even typical for the rest of the world. Most of them live in much more difficult situations. If I've learned nothing else in my many years in many different environments, is that there are no simple solutions to complex problems. It's very important to identify the problem, but it's very important to get to the real root of the problem, not to allow people to cause us to do superficial things that make us feel good, but never really fix what the problem is. I believe in the power of community. I believe that's why I like this video. The solution to these things, whether here or anywhere else, now certainly governments and different entities can support good ideas, but these things, these issues will be fixed, and I'm going to talk more about that as we get towards the end of the presentation, will be handled on an individual, community-wide basis. And the fact that people are given the ability and the understanding to take care of themselves in a world that will not and cannot provide for them in all circumstances is a really good step in the right direction. So, with that, we'll move forward. Archer Daniels Midland. How many of you even know what Archer Daniels Midland is? Wow, that's impressive. Now, I've been with ADM a little less than 10 years now, and when we first started doing these presentations, almost nobody knew who ADM was. And that was really by design. ADM didn't want a lot of publicity. We don't sell retail goods. The idea was to keep a very low profile, to do the good things that the company does. And by the way, a little bit more about me and ADM. I suspect, and when I went to ADM, I was a little bit concerned. I'd never worked in a large corporate environment. I wasn't really sure what I was getting into, and I'd heard all of these things about greed and corporate greed and all that kind of stuff too. In fact, I went to ADM not too long after the price fixing scandal that you've all seen, the rats in the grain and all the movies and the books that were written about that. So I was a little concerned. I don't think anybody's ever challenged my integrity, and I didn't want to be associated with anybody else who would. But I knew the guy who was a director of corporate security there, and I knew I would have bet my life, which turned out to be correct, that he would never ask me to do anything unethical and certainly nothing illegal. What I've found is not at all what I expected to find in that corporate environment. By and large, ADM and many of the other large corporations I've seen and worked around at the national level are incredibly caring and ethical people. They do very, very good work. And in Brazil, for example, when we, as you'll see, most of, we have a lot of operations in the United States. We have a lot of operations all over the world, and a very, very large percentage of those operations are in very unsafe, unstable places. Pretty soon you're going to see a bunch of slides on cocoa. We're the largest cocoa processor in the world. Let me tell you, cocoa doesn't grow in safe places. Cocoa plants only grow a few degrees north or south of the equator, and if you draw that line around the world, you don't find many stable governments. So we see a lot of what happens around the world with the origination of grains and food products, and also everywhere that stuff goes, the full food supply chain. And that's one of the things I want you to, I hope we get out of this discussion this afternoon, is an understanding that, while it's important for communities and people to be able to produce, to some degree provide for themselves, because large systems sometimes fail in spite of our best efforts. The reality is that when we as humans moved into large urban environments, we gave up the ability to have family farms where everybody produces enough food to feed themselves. Can't happen, won't happen, probably will never again in human history happen. Now, certainly that doesn't mean a neighborhood can't take care of themselves, but when you look at other parts of the world where those capabilities just don't exist, if we don't have a means to efficiently produce food, there's going to be a lot of people starved to death, and I don't think anybody in this room would want that to happen. So, again, we're talking about very, very complex systems. Well, let's get on a little bit more about, if you look at the types of businesses we're in, oilseeds, we make lots of vegetable oil and the things that come out of that. All of these are ingredients. None of these things that we make at ADM are retail products sold as those retail products. They go into most other things that you eat. But that's a part of the story here. Well, let's get on a little bit more about, if you look at the types of businesses we're in, oilseeds, we make lots of vegetable oil and the things that come out of that. All of these are ingredients. None of these things that we make at ADM are retail products sold as those retail products. They go into most other things that you eat. But that's a part of the story here. What we want to keep in mind is that the food supply, other than direct consumables, those kind of things that you grow and eat yourself, most of the stuff we eat, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the pops that people will say are not really good for you, down to cereals and all kinds of things that have ingredients literally in many cases that come from all over the world. That creates a whole lot of issues, not just whether they're healthy or not, and there's certainly debate on that. I'd be very cautious about the people that say, if you don't eat organic food, you're not eating healthy stuff. That's simply not true. Don't take my word for it. I'm a trigger puller cop. Get a hold of the people on both sides and listen to both sides of those arguments. But the idea here is, and I think you saw a slide earlier about, I can't necessarily worry, some people saying that they can't necessarily worry about having only the best organic food. I need to survive. Well, that method or that message is very, very real around the world. And the production of healthy food, nobody, and I have never ever heard anybody suggest that they would intentionally produce and market. In fact, you wouldn't stay in business very long if you knowingly produced food that was harmful to people. It's just not business. Now there are things, you'll see things that come out in research that, high fructose corn syrup, we make a lot of high fructose corn syrup, a lot of debate about whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. And that's beyond the scope of this discussion, but I can tell you there are people on both sides of that argument, and I suggest that you pay attention to both sides before you draw any immediate conclusions. But let's get back to that food supply. I went to ADM not too long after September 11, 2001, and the idea was to look at what ADM's vulnerability was to terrorism. ADM's a food company, so one of the first things that we looked at was, is there a risk of terrorist acts on food? And we'll make a long story short there, and there certainly is, and we're working very hard to address that at the national level. I chair the DHS Food Ag Sector Joint Committee on Research for Food Defense, so we know the complexities of the issue. We don't really know the extent of the problem. But the story here is that TTEC is the Terrorist Threat Integration Center. After September 11th, you all remember that fingers started flying all over. How did this happen? Why did this happen? And one of the things that came out of that was that the intelligence community didn't connect the dots for whatever reason. TTEC was one of the responses. It was a Terrorist Threat Integration Center where all of the intelligence community, all of the intelligence related to terrorism was supposed to come into one place so everybody would share it and go on. The very first conference after that place stood up, the very first one that the intelligence community wanted to talk about was food defense. Now, our friends at the FBI call that a clue. And we don't know what they know, but if they're concerned that that's the first thing after September 11th they wanted to talk about, we took notice. I gave a presentation there. And as we went through this discussion, this was in 2004. A few years following that, DHS did what security people, DHS was very new then too, and very much learning, the ropes and how to deal with threats that we had never had to face in this world before, or certainly not in this country to that degree. DHS applied what security people have always applied: target hardening, asset-specific things. Look at a building, see if it's, what's the likelihood somebody would hurt it? What's the consequence if that happened, and what do you do about it? That's basic risk assessment 101. And what we tried to explain to them, even in 2004, was that if you apply that to food, that type of risk assessment methodology, you're going to miss the boat badly. Because food, in every sense of the word, is an international, complex, dynamic system of systems. And if you only look at specific points in that system, you can never protect the system. Now that has to do not only with security, but that same concept needs to be applied to resilience, to the provision of safe and healthy food to the world's population. If we don't understand what this network of networks is and how difficult and complex it is to even understand it, you'll never really get a handle on how you manage that system to provide that safe, healthy food to the world's population. Again, this is just kind of a foundation information that, it's beyond the scope of this discussion to get into a whole lot of detail there, but realize that exists. The ingredients, we don't have many operations in China. They're expanding, but I can tell you that many of the things that you eat that we think are healthy because they have vitamins in them, those vitamins are produced in China. And let me tell you something about the rest of the world. It ain't like Kansas. They do things differently. They have different cultures, that things are okay in those environments that are not okay. And as we approach all of these concepts that are well intended in the U.S., from a U.S.-centric approach, we tend to be very naive as to how the rest of the world approaches those things. It just doesn't work. And there will be some more examples. In fact, FSMA is one of those. FSMA is the Food Safety Modernization Act, just passed, signed by President Obama. But there's some realities here, and this is part of a presentation I did at the FBI's International Symposium on Agroterrorism about 2 months ago now. But one of the things that FSMA does is put responsibility on corporations for the safety of all product coming in. That's easy to say, it's impossible to do. So what I'm telling you here is that as you see this whole discussion of safe food, don't think for a minute that regulations will ever provide for safe food. It can't happen, it won't happen. I didn't put that slide in there, I don't think, but and this isn't a discussion of FSMA, but one of the things that's a reality of all kinds of defensive mechanisms is that you can't regulate defense. It just doesn't work. When I was in the Marines too, one of the things that we used to say there was camouflage is continuous. That means that if you don't change your defensive posture as you move forward, the bad guys will figure out what you're doing, adapt to that, and they'll get you anyway. We have to continually be able to change identify what that risk is, and adapt to it, or we're going to get hammered. Now, that's, again, these things I'm talking about a lot of this in the context of defense and security, but everything I'm saying from a conceptual basis applies to the provision of food. Food system characteristics. There's we heard today and we hear often these suggestions that we shouldn't be using fertilizers anymore. That people should grow their own food. And even there was somebody that we saw a presentation once a few years ago where a guy was running a farm outside Kansas, and his perspective was that you shouldn't use seeds. You grow plants, and if they drop their own seed and regrow, that's fine. If they don't, I guess you go hungry. All those things sound really nice in an academic environment where there are no consequences if you're wrong. They don't play real well when you have a really hungry population that needs a lot of food. So again, what I hope we do with this discussion is keep grounded in reality. There are a lot of people that need food. There are a lot of people that need to eat, and there is not going to be any one simple solution to the way we provide for that. And that's around the world, not just in our urban environments.